Now, economic, financial and political decision makers have convened at the New York Forum Africa that is currently taking place in Libreville, Gabon. This year's theme is centered around the importance of the local African economic fabric and notably small and medium enterprises. CNBC Africa's Wole Famrewa spoke to Thierry Tano, CEO of EcoBank, on how the financial services sector is participating in Africa's growth story.
Once again, thank you for inviting the EcoBank in CNBC Africa. It's a great honor to be here. We have said that we want to grow at 15%. We continue to believe that we can grow at a minimum of 15%. That's what I would like to say. And what we're seeing in the first quarter that has been published is very encouraging. Africa is indeed a lot of potential, as I've always said, to a certain extent, which might be an issue because we talk a lot about the potential and not its realizations. EcoBank is a perfect example of realization of this potential, which is growing at a steady pace and also financing the economy.
Right. Okay, let's talk a bit about the opportunity that a lot of people talk about in Africa, which is the consumer. And I want to get your thoughts about how the financial services sector is getting involved in that story. We're seeing quite a few brands coming into places like Nigeria, for instance, where there's such a huge consumer market. So your thoughts about how financial services companies like yours are getting involved in this opportunity?
So we're involved in a lot of aspects. First, we're involved in what is the most important in growing Africa is intra-Africa trade, okay? And for us being present almost in 33 countries very soon, we are currently being able to finance trade within Africa with huge potential. Today it's 12%. The EU today is about 80%, so you can see the great potential that we have there. We want to be present there and we want to finance it. We want also to go and finance consumer goods because I think consumption is also good for growing the economy. But this is also why it is important to make sure that we're growing in a reasonable manner indebtedness of household on the continent, so we don't fall into the trap of over-indebtedness of household. And that's why regulations to make sure that access to information will be important in growing this sector, this segment of the market.
Right. What about the riskiness of Africa? If we look at the experience in Nigeria, for instance, where we saw a banking crisis a few years ago, risk management has now become a major issue. It's on the front burner for Nigerian banks, but clearly some institutions were burnt by that, and to some extent even EcoBank. Now let's talk a bit about the riskiness of Africa as you pursue this opportunity, because a lot of people talk about the SME space, for instance, as being the next big opportunity in Africa. Talk to us about that.
Well, I think the risk in Africa is overstated, and I truly believe this. Until very recently, people felt that the US were the best market, where there was almost the risk-free market, and look what happened. And so this doesn't exist. I think the issues about Africa is the continent is not known enough, and as a result, it's known by investors through what they see on TV, which is not very glamorous. We tend to, and the media actually, you tend to portray the scandals, the war. But there's a lot of successful story in Africa. There's a lot of successful investors that we don't see, or entrepreneurs that we don't see enough on CNBC Africa, and I encourage you to do that. So as a result, what happens is people are rating the risk in Africa way higher than what it is. So it's good in a sense which allow institutions such as EcoBank to grow on this market, but it's not good in the long term because pricing in Africa is just too high at the present moment. So we need to work in bringing a better image on the continent.
All right, but staying with that SME story,
yeah.
I want to get your thoughts on how EcoBank is approaching that, because a lot of people talk about the big businesses, the large corporations, the Dangotes, for instance, as being the opportunity that a lot of banks seem to be focused on because they perceive that as lower risk. But a lot of people say that if the banks can be innovative, they can find a way to unplug the opportunity in the SME space. That's a huge market.
But that's exact. To us, the SME space is one of the most important sectors, and we're actively working and financing it. And I think we go even beyond this to reach out more people with mobile money, for example, which allows you to bank the unbanked. But if you stay with the SME sector, it's the engine of growth in Africa, and it would be inconceivable for EcoBank not to be a major player on that sector. We are working on it now, but I think we're also, as I mentioned to you earlier, we're also working in putting in place an environment which would allow us to put a right framework so that bank could lend in a more not safer, but taking more reasonable risk, or at least a better assessed risk, with better access to information when it comes to assess the SMEs, but also being able also to enforce security when they're in place in a reasonable time frame. The combination of this factor would allow us to reduce the cost of lending, and as such to increase the number of SMEs to which we will provide financial support. But clearly, this sector for EcoBank